The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. When Abel Gay paid Valancy her first month's wages, which she did promptly in bills reeking with the odor of tobacco and whiskey, Valancy went into Deerwood and spent every cent of it. She got a pretty green crepe dress with a girdle of crimson beads, at a bargain sale, a pair of silk stockings to match, and a little crinkled green hat with a crimson rose in it. She even bought a foolish little beribboned and belaced nightgown. She passed the house on Elm Street twice. Valancy never even thought about it as home, but saw no one. No doubt her mother was sitting in the room this lovely June evening, playing solitaire and cheating. Valancy knew that Mrs. Frederick always cheated. She never lost a game. Most of the people Valancy met looked at her seriously and passed her with a cool nod. Nobody stopped to speak to her. Valancy put on her green dress when she got home. Then she took it off again. She felt so miserably undressed in its low neck and short sleeves, and that low, crimson girdle around the hips seemed positively indecent. She hung it up in the closet, feeling flatly that she had wasted her money. She would never have the courage to wear that dress. John Foster's arraignment of fear had no power to stiffen her against this. In this one thing, habit and custom were still all-powerful. Yet, she sighed as she went down to meet Barney Snaith in her old snuff-brown silk. That green thing had been very becoming. She had seen so much in her one ashamed glance. Above it, her eyes had looked like odd brown jewels, and the girdle had given her flat figure an entirely different appearance. She wished she could have left it on. But there were some things John Foster did not know. Every Sunday evening, Valancy went to the little Free Methodist church in a valley on the edge of Up Back, a spireless little gray building among the pines, with a few sunken graves and mossy gravestones in the small, paling-encircled, grass-grown square beside it. She liked the minister who preached there. He was so simple and sincere. An old man, who lived in Port Lawrence and came out by the lake in a little disappearing propeller boat to give free service to the people of the small, stony farms back of the hills, who would otherwise never have heard any gospel message. She liked the simple service and the fervent singing. She liked to sit by the open window and look out into the pine woods. The congregation was always small. The Free Methodists were few in number, poor, and generally illiterate. But Valancy loved those Sunday evenings. For the first time in her life she liked going to church. The rumor reached Deerwood that she had turned Free Methodist and sent Mrs. Frederick to bed for a day. But Valancy had not turned anything. She went to the church because she liked it, and because, in some inexplicable way, it did her good. Old Mr. Towers believed exactly what he preached, and somehow it made a tremendous difference. Oddly enough, Roaring Abel disapproved of her going to the Hill Church as strongly as Mrs. Frederick herself could have done. He had no use for Free Methodists. He was a Presbyterian, but Valancy went in spite of him. "We'll hear something worse than that about her soon," Uncle Benjamin predicted gloomily. They did. Valancy could not quite explain, even to herself, just why she wanted to go to that party. It was a dance up back at Chidley Corners, and dances at Chidley Corners were not, as a rule, the sort of assemblies where well-brought-up young ladies were found. Valancy knew it was coming off, for Roaring Abel had been engaged as one of the fiddlers. But the idea of going had never occurred to her until Roaring Abel himself broached it at supper. "You come with me to the dance," he ordered. "It'll do you good. Put some color in your face. You look peaked. You want something to liven you up." Valancy found herself suddenly wanting to go. She knew nothing at all of what dances at Chidley Corners were apt to be like. Her idea of dances had been fashioned on the corrective fairs that went by that name in Deerwood and Port Lawrence. Of course she knew the Corners dances wouldn't be just like them. Much more informal, of course, but so much the more interesting. Why shouldn't she go? Sissy was in a week of apparent health and improvement. She wouldn't mind staying alone in the least. She entreated Valancy to go if she wanted to, and Valancy did want to go. She went to her room to dress. A rage against the snuff-brown silk seized her. Wear that to a party? Never! She pulled a green crepe from its hanger and put it on feverishly. It was nonsense to feel so naked, just because her neck and arms were bare. That was just her old maidishness. She would not be ridden by it. On went the dress, the slippers. It was the first time she had worn a pretty dress since the organdies of her early teens, and they had never made her look like this. If only she had a necklace or something, she wouldn't feel so bare then. She ran down to the garden. There were clovers there, great crimson things growing in the long grass. Valancy gathered handfuls of them and strung them on a cord. Fastened above her neck, they gave her the comfortable sensation of a collar and were oddly becoming. Another circlet of them went round her hair, dressed in the low puffs that became her. Excitement brought those faint pink stains to her face. She flung on her coat and pulled the little twisty hat over her hair. "You look so nice and different, dear," said Sissy. "Like a green moonbeam with a gleam of red in it, if there could be such a thing." Valancy stooped to kiss her. "I don't feel right about leaving you alone, Sissy." "Oh, I'll be all right. I feel better tonight than I have for a long while. I've been feeling badly to see you sticking here so closely on my account. I hope you have a nice time. I never was at a party at the Corners, but I used to go sometimes, long ago, to dances up back. We always had good times. And you needn't be afraid of Father being drunk tonight. He never drinks when he engages to play for a party. But there may be liquor. What will you do if it gets rough?" "Nobody would molest me." "Not seriously, I suppose. Father would see to that. But it might be noisy and unpleasant." "I won't mind. I'm only going as a looker-on. I don't expect to dance. I just want to see what a party up back is like. I've never seen anything except decorous deerwood." Sissy smiled rather dubiously. She knew much better than Valancy what a party up back might be like if there should be liquor. But again, there mightn't be. "I hope you'll enjoy it," she repeated. Valancy enjoyed the drive there. They went early, for it was 12 miles to Chidley Corners, and they had to go in Abel's old, ragged top buggy. The road was rough and rocky, like most Muskoka roads, but full of the austere charm of northern woods. It wound through beautiful, purring pines that were ranks of enchantment in the June sunset, and over the curious jade-green rivers of Muskoka, fringed by aspens that were always quivering with some supernal joy. Roaring Abel was excellent company, too. He knew all the stories and legends of the wild, beautiful up back, and he told them to Valancy as they drove along. Valancy had several fits of inward laughter over what Uncle Benjamin and Aunt Wellington et al. Would feel and think and say if they saw her driving with Roaring Abel in that terrible buggy to a dance at Chidley Corners. At first the dance was quiet enough, and Valancy was amused and entertained. She even danced twice herself with a couple of nice up-back boys who danced beautifully and told her she did too. Another compliment came her way, not a very subtle one, perhaps, but Valancy had had too few compliments in her life to be over-nice on that point. She overheard 2 of the up-back young men talking about her in the dark lean-to behind her. "Know who that girl in green is?" "Nope. Guess she's from out front. The port, maybe. Got a stylish look to her." "No beaut, but cute lookin', I'll say. Did you ever see such eyes?" The big room was decorated with pine and fir boughs, and lighted by Chinese lanterns. The floor was waxed, and Roaring Abel's fiddle, purring under his skilled touch, worked magic. The up-back girls were pretty and prettily dressed. Valancy thought it the nicest party she had ever attended. By 11 o'clock she had changed her mind. A new crowd had arrived, a crowd unmistakably drunk. Whiskey began to circulate freely. Very soon almost all the men were partly drunk. Those in the porch and outside around the door began howling, "Come all yees," and continued to howl them. The room grew noisy and reeking. Quarrels started up here and there. Bad language and obscene songs were heard. The girls, swung rudely in the dances, became disheveled and tawdry. Valancy, alone in her corner, was feeling disgusted and repentant. Why had she ever come to such a place? Freedom and independence were all very well, but one should not be a little fool. She might have known what it would be like. She might have taken warning from Sissy's guarded sentences. Her head was aching. She was sick of the whole thing. But what could she do? She must stay to the end. Abel could not leave till then, and that would probably not be until 3 or 4 in the morning. The new influx of boys had left the girls far in the minority, and partners were scarce. Valancy was pestered with invitations to dance. She refused them all shortly, and some of her refusals were not well taken. There were muttered oaths and sullen looks. Across the room she saw a group of the strangers talking together and glancing meaningly at her. What were they plotting? It was at this moment that she saw Barney Snaith looking in over the heads of the crowds at the doorway. Valancy had 2 distinct convictions. One was that she was quite safe now. The other was that this was why she had wanted to come to the dance. It had been such an absurd hope that she had not recognized it before, but now she knew that she had come because of the possibility that Barney might be there, too. She thought that perhaps she ought to be ashamed for this, but she wasn't. After her feelings of relief, her next feeling was one of annoyance with Barney for coming there unshaved. Surely he might have enough self-respect to groom himself up decently when he went to a party. There he was, bareheaded, bristly-chinned, in his old trousers and his blue homespun shirt. Not even a coat. Valancy could have shaken him in her anger. No wonder people believed everything bad of him. But she was not afraid any longer. One of the whispering group left his comrades and came across the room to her, through the whirling couples that now filled it uncomfortably. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow, not ill-dressed or ill-looking, but unmistakably half-drunk. He asked Valancy to dance. Valancy declined civilly. His face turned livid. He threw his arm about her and pulled her to him. His hot, whiskey breath burned her face. "We won't have fine lady airs here, my girl. If you ain't too good to come here, you ain't too good to dance with us. Me and my pals have been watching you. You've got to give us each a turn and a kiss to boot." Valancy tried desperately and vainly to free herself. She was being dragged out into the maze of shouting, stamping, yelling dancers. The next moment the man who held her went staggering across the room from a neatly planted blow on the jaw, knocking down whirling couples as he went. Valancy felt her arm grasped. "This way, quick," said Barney Snaith. He swung her out through the open window behind him, vaulted lightly over the sill, and caught her hand. "Quick, we must run for it. They'll be after us." Valancy ran as she had never run before, clinging tight to Barney's hand, wondering why she did not drop dead in such a mad scamper. Suppose she did! What a scandal it would make for her poor people. For the first time, Valancy felt a little sorry for them. Also, she felt glad that she had escaped from that horrible row. Also, glad that she was holding tight to Barney's hand. Her feelings were badly mixed, and she had never had so many in such a brief time in her life. They finally reached a quiet corner in the pine woods. The pursuit had taken a different direction, and the whoops and yells behind them were growing faint. Valancy, out of breath, with a crazily beating heart, collapsed on the trunk of a fallen pine. "Thanks," she gasped. "What a goose you were to come to such a place," said Barney. "I didn't know it would be like this," protested Valancy. "You should have known. Chidley Corners! It was just a name to me." Valancy knew Barney could not realize how ignorant she was of the regions up back. She had lived in Deerwood all her life, and of course he supposed she knew. He didn't know how she had been brought up. There was no use trying to explain. "When I drifted in at Abel's this evening, and Sissy told me you'd come here, I was amazed and downright scared. Sissy told me she was worried about you, but hadn't liked to say anything to dissuade you for fear you'd think she was thinking selfishly about herself. So I came on up here instead of going to Deerwood." Valancy felt a sudden delightful glow irradiating soul and body under the dark pines. So he had actually come to look after her. "As soon as they stop hunting for us, we'll sneak around to the Muskoka Road. I left Lady Jane down there. I'll take you home. I suppose you've had enough of your party." "Quite," said Valancy meekly. The first half of the way home, neither of them said anything. It would not have been much use. Lady Jane made so much noise they could not have heard each other. Anyway, Valancy did not feel conversationally inclined. She was ashamed of the whole affair, ashamed of her folly in going, ashamed for being found at such a place by Barney Snaith. By Barney Snaith, reputed jailbreaker, infidel, forger and defaulter. Valancy's lips twitched in the darkness as she thought of it, but she was ashamed. And yet she was enjoying herself, was full of a strange exultation, bumping over that rough road beside Barney Snaith. The big trees shot by them. The tall mulleins stood up along the road in stiff, orderly ranks like companies of soldiers. The thistles looked like drunken fairies or tipsy elves as their car lights passed over them. This was the first time she had ever been in a car. After all, she liked it. She was not in the least afraid, with Barney at the wheel. Her spirits rose rapidly as they tore along. She ceased to feel ashamed. She ceased to feel anything except that she was part of a comet rushing gloriously through the night of space. All at once, just where the pine woods frayed out to the scrub barrens, Lady Jane became quiet. Too quiet. Lady Jane slowed down quietly and stopped. Barney uttered an aghast exclamation, got out, investigated, came apologetically back. "I'm a doddering idiot. Out of gas. I knew I was short when I left home, but I meant to fill up in Deerwood. Then I forgot all about it in my hurry to get to the Corners." "What can we do?" asked Valancy coolly. "I don't know. There's no gas nearer than Deerwood, 9 miles away, and I don't dare leave you here alone. There are always tramps on this road, and some of those crazy fools back at the Corners may come straggling along presently. There were boys there, from the port. As far as I can see, the best thing to do is for us just to sit patiently here until some car comes along and lends us enough gas to get to Roaring Abel's with." "Well, what's the matter with that?" said Valancy. "We may have to sit here all night," said Barney. "I don't mind," said Valancy. Barney gave a short laugh. "If you don't, I needn't. I haven't any reputation to lose." "Nor I," said Valancy comfortably. End of chapter 20.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 21. "We'll just sit here," said Barney, "and if we think of anything worthwhile saying, we'll say it. Otherwise, not. Don't imagine you're bound to talk to me." "John Foster says," quoted Valancy, "if you can sit in silence with a person for half an hour and yet be entirely comfortable, you and that person can be friends. If you cannot, friends you'll never be, and you need not wasting time in trying. Evidently, John Foster says a sensible thing once in a while, conceded Barney. They sat in silence for a long while. Little rabbits hopped across the road. Once or twice an owl laughed out delightfully. The road beyond them was fringed with the woven shadow lace of trees. Away off to the southwest, the sky was full of silvery little cirrus clouds above the spot where Barney's island must be. Valancy was perfectly happy. Some things dawn on you slowly. Some things come by lightning flashes. Valancy had had a lightning flash. She knew quite well now that she loved Barney. Yesterday she had been all her own. Now she was this man's. Yet he had done nothing, said nothing. He had not even looked at her as a woman, but that didn't matter. Nor did it matter what he was or what he had done. She loved him without any reservations. Everything in her went out wholly to him. She had no wish to stifle or disown her love. She seemed to be his so absolutely that thought apart from him, thought in which he did not predominate, was an impossibility. She had realized, quite simply and fully, that she loved him in the moment when he was leaning on the car door, explaining that Lady Jane had no gas. She had looked deep into his eyes in the moonlight and had known. In just that infinitesimal space of time, everything was changed. Old things passed away and all things became new. She was no longer unimportant, little old maid Valancy Stirling. She was a woman full of love and therefore rich and significant, justified to herself. Life was no longer empty and futile, and death could cheat her of nothing. Love had cast out her last fear. Love, what a searing, torturing, intolerably sweet thing it was, this possession of body, soul, and mind, with something at its core as fine and remote and purely spiritual as the tiny blue spark in the heart of the unbreakable diamond. No dream had ever been like this. She was no longer solitary. She was one of a vast sisterhood, all the women who had ever loved in the world. Barney need never know it, though she would not in the least have minded his knowing, but she knew it, and it made a tremendous difference to her. Just to love. She did not ask to be loved. It was rapture enough just to sit there beside him in silence, alone in the summer night in the white splendor of moonshine, with the wind blowing down on them out of the pine woods. She had always envied the wind, so free, blowing where it listed, through the hills, over the lakes. What a tang, what a zip it had, what a magic of adventure. Valancy felt as if she had exchanged her shop-worn soul for a fresh one, fire new from the workshop of the gods. As far back as she could look, life had been dull, colorless, savorless. Now she had come to a little patch of violets, purple and fragrant, hers for the plucking. No matter who or what had been in Barney's past, no matter who or what might be in his future, no one else could ever have this perfect hour. She surrendered herself utterly to the charm of the moment. "Ever dream of ballooning?" said Barney suddenly. "No," said Valancy. "I do often dream of sailing through the clouds, seeing the glories of sunset, spending hours in the midst of a terrific storm with lightning playing above and below you, skimming above a silver cloud floor under a full moon. Wonderful." "It does sound so," said Valancy. "I've stayed on earth in my dreams." She told him about her blue castle. It was so easy to tell Barney things. One felt he understood everything, even the things you didn't tell him. And then she told him a little of her existence before she came to Roaring Abel's. She wanted him to see why she had gone to the dance up back. "You see, I've never had any real life," she said. "I've just breathed. Every door has always been shut to me. "But you're still young," said Barney. "Oh, I know. Yes, I'm still young, but that's so different from young," said Valancy bitterly. For a moment she was tempted to tell Barney why her years had nothing to do with her future, but she did not. She was not going to think of death tonight. "Though I never was really young," she went on, "until tonight," she added in her heart. "I never had a life like other girls. You couldn't understand." Why? She had a desperate desire that Barney should know the worst about her. "I didn't even love my mother. Isn't it awful that I don't love my mother?" "Rather awful for her," said Barney dryly. "Oh, she didn't know it. She took my love for granted, and I wasn't any use or comfort to her or anybody. I was just a vegetable, and I got tired of it. That's why I came to keep house for Mr. Gay and look after Sissy. And I suppose your people thought you'd gone mad." "They did, and do, literally," said Valancy. "But it's a comfort to them. They'd rather believe me mad than bad. There's no other alternative. But I've been living since I came to Mr. Gay's. It's been a delightful experience. I suppose I'll pay for it when I have to go back, but I'll have had it." "That's true," said Barney. "If you buy your experience, it's your own. So it's no matter how much you pay for it. Somebody else's experience can never be yours. Well, it's a funny old world." "Do you think it really is old?" asked Valancy dreamily. "I never believed that in June. It seemed so young tonight, somehow, in that quivering moonlight, like a young white girl waiting." "Moonlight here on the verge of Up Back is different from moonlight anywhere else," agreed Barney. "It always makes me feel so clean somehow, body and soul. And of course the age of gold always comes back in spring." It was 10 o'clock now. A dragon of black cloud ate up the moon. The spring air grew chill. Valancy shivered. Barney reached back into the innards of Lady Jane and clawed up an old tobacco-scented overcoat. "Put that on," he ordered. "Don't you want it yourself?" protested Valancy. "No, I'm not going to have you catching cold on my hands." "Oh, I won't catch cold. I haven't had a cold since I came to Mr. Gay's, though I've done the foolishest things. It's funny, too. I used to have them all the time. I feel so selfish taking your coat." "You've sneezed 3 times. No use winding up your experience up back with grippe or pneumonia." He pulled it up tight about her throat and buttoned it on her. Valancy submitted with secret delight. How nice it was to have someone look after you so. She snuggled down into the tobacco-y folds and wished the night could last forever. 10 minutes later, a car swooped down on them from Up Back. Barney sprang from Lady Jane and waved his hand. The car came to a stop beside them. Valancy saw Uncle Wellington and Olive gazing at her in horror from it. So Uncle Wellington had got a car, and he must have been spending the evening up at Miss Dawa's with Cousin Herbert. Valancy almost laughed aloud at the expression on his face as he recognized her, the pompous, bewhiskered old humbug. "Can you let me have enough gas to take me to Deerwood?" Barney was asking politely, but Uncle Wellington was not attending to him. "Valancy, how came you here?" he said sternly. "By chance, or God's grace," said Valancy. "With this jailbird, at 10 o'clock at night," said Uncle Wellington. Valancy turned to Barney. The moon had escaped from its dragon, and in its light her eyes were full of deviltry. "Are you a jailbird?" "Does it matter?" said Barney, gleams of fun in his eyes. "Not to me. I only asked out of curiosity," continued Valancy. "Then I won't tell you. I never satisfy curiosity." He turned to Uncle Wellington, and his voice changed subtly. "Mr. Stirling, I asked you if you could let me have some gas. If you can, well and good. If not, we are only delaying you unnecessarily. Uncle Wellington was in a horrible dilemma. To give gas to this shameless pair, but not to give it to them. To go away and leave them there in the mischievous woods until daylight, likely. It was better to give it to them and let them get out of sight before anyone else saw them. Got anything to get gas in? He grunted surlily. Barney produced a 2-gallon measure from Lady Jane. The two men went to the rear of the Stirling car and began manipulating the tap. Valancy stole sly glances at Olive over the collar of Barney's coat. Olive was sitting grimly, staring straight ahead with an outraged expression. She did not mean to take any notice of Valancy. Olive had her own secret reasons for feeling outraged. Cecil had been in Deerwood lately, and of course had heard all about Valancy. He agreed that her mind was changed, and was exceedingly anxious to find out whence the derangement had been inherited. It was a serious thing to have in the family, a very serious thing. One had to think of one's descendants. She got it from the Wansboroughs, said Olive positively. There's nothing like that in the Stirlings. Nothing. I hope not. I certainly hope not, Cecil had responded dubiously. But then, to go out as a servant, for that is what it practically amounts to. Your cousin. Poor Olive felt the implication. The Port Lawrence Prices were not accustomed to ally themselves with families whose members worked out. Valancy could not resist temptation. She leaned forward. Olive, does it hurt? Olive bit stiffly. Does what hurt? Looking like that. For a moment, Olive resolved she would take no further notice of Valancy. Then duty came uppermost. She must not miss the opportunity. Doss, she implored, leaning forward also. Won't you come home? Come home tonight. Valancy yawned. You sound like a revival meeting, she said. You really do. If you come back, all will be forgiven. Yes, said Olive eagerly. Wouldn't it be splendid if she could induce the prodigal daughter to return? We'll never cast it up to you. Doss, there are nights when I cannot sleep for thinking of you. And me, having the time of my life, said Valancy, laughing. Doss, I can't believe you're bad. I've always said you couldn't be bad. I don't believe I can be, said Valancy. I'm afraid I'm hopelessly proper. I've been sitting here for 3 hours with Barney Snaith, and he hasn't even tried to kiss me. I wouldn't have minded if he had, Olive. Valancy was still leaning forward. Her little hat with its crimson rose was tilted down over one eye. Valancy's smile. What had happened to Valancy? She looked not pretty. Doss couldn't be pretty, but provocative, fascinating, yes, abominably so. Olive drew back. It was beneath her dignity to say more. After all, Valancy must be both mad and bad. Thanks, that's enough, said Barney behind the car. Much obliged, Mr. Stirling. 2 gallons, 70 cents. Thank you. Uncle Wellington climbed foolishly and feebly into his car. He wanted to give Snaith a piece of his mind, but dared not. Who knew what the creature might do if provoked? No doubt he carried firearms. Uncle Wellington looked indecisively at Valancy, but Valancy had turned her back on him and was watching Barney pour the gas into Lady Jane's maw. Drive on, said Olive decisively. There's no use in waiting here. Let me tell you what she said to me. The little hussy, the shameless little hussy, said Uncle Wellington. End of chapter 21.
Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery, Chapter 22. The next thing the Stirlings heard was that Valancy had been seen with Barney Snaith in a movie theatre in Port Lawrence, and after it at supper in a Chinese restaurant there. This was quite true, and no one was more surprised at it than Valancy herself. Barney had come along in Lady Jane one dim twilight, and told Valancy unceremoniously if she wanted a drive to hop in. "I'm going to the port. Will you go there with me?" His eyes were teasing, and there was a bit of defiance in his voice. Valancy, who did not conceal from herself that she would have gone anywhere with him to any place, hopped in without more ado. They tore into and through Deerwood. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles, taking a little air on the veranda, saw them whirl by in a cloud of dust and sought comfort in each other's eyes. Valancy, who in some dim pre-existence had been afraid of a car, was hatless, and her hair was blowing wildly round her face. She would certainly come down with bronchitis and die at Roaring Abel's. She wore a low-neck dress, and her arms were bare. That Snaith creature was in his shirt-sleeves, smoking a pipe. They were going at the rate of 40 miles an hour. 60, Cousin Stickles averred. Lady Jane could hit the pike when she wanted to. Valancy waved her hand gaily to her relatives. As for Mrs. Frederick, she was wishing she knew how to go into hysterics. "Was it for this," she demanded in hollow tones, "that I suffered the pangs of motherhood?" "I will not believe," said Cousin Stickles solemnly, "that our prayers will not yet be answered." Who will protect that unfortunate girl when I am gone?" moaned Mrs. Frederick. As for Valancy, she was wondering if it could really be only a few weeks since she had sat there with them on that veranda. Hating the rubber plant, pestered with teasing questions like black flies, always thinking of appearances, cowed because of old Wellington's teaspoons and Uncle Benjamin's money, poverty-stricken, afraid of everybody, envying Olive, a slave to moth-eaten traditions, nothing to hope for or expect. And now every day was a gay adventure. Lady Jane flew over the 15 miles between Deerwood and the port, through the port. The way Barney went past traffic policemen was not holly. The lights were beginning to twinkle out like stars in the clear, lemon-hued twilight air. This was the only time Valancy ever really liked the town, and she was crazy with the delight of speeding. Was it possible she had ever been afraid of a car? She was perfectly happy, riding beside Barney. Not that she deluded herself into thinking he'd had any significance. She knew quite well that Barney had asked her to go on the impulse of the moment, an impulse born of a feeling of pity for her and her starved little dreams. She was looking tired after a wakeful night with a heart attack, followed by a busy day. She had so little fun. He'd given her an outing for once. Besides, Abel was in the kitchen, at the point of drunkenness, where he was declaring he did not believe in God and beginning to sing ribald songs. It was just as well she should be out of the way for a while. Barney knew Roaring Abel's repertoire. They went to the movie. Valancy had never been to a movie. And then, finding a nice hunger upon them, they went and had fried chicken, unbelievably delicious, in the Chinese restaurant. After which they rattled home again, leaving a devastating trail of scandal behind them. Mrs. Frederick gave up going to church altogether. She could not endure her friends' pitying glances and questions. But Cousin Stickles went every Sunday. She said they had been given a cross to bear. End of chapter 23.
The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. On one of Sissy's wakeful nights, she told Valancy her poor little story. They were sitting by the open window. Sissy could not get her breath lying down that night. An inglorious gibbous moon was hanging over the wooded hills, and, in its spectral light, Sissy looked frail and lovely and incredibly young. A child. It did not seem possible that she could have lived through all the passion and pain and shame of her story. He was stopping at the hotel across the lake. He used to come over in his canoe at night. We met in the pines down the shore. He was a young college student. His father was a rich man in Toronto. Oh, Valancy, I didn't mean to be bad. I didn't, indeed. But I loved him so. I love him yet. I'll always love him. And I didn't know some things. I didn't understand. Then his father came and took him away. And, after a little, I found out. Oh, Valancy, I was so frightened. I didn't know what to do. I wrote him and he came. He said he would marry me, Valancy. And why? And why? Oh, Valancy, he didn't love me any more. I saw that at a glance. He was just offering to marry me because he thought he ought to, because he was sorry for me. He wasn't bad, but he was so young, and what was I that he should keep on loving me? Never mind making excuses for him, said Valancy, a bit shortly. So you wouldn't marry him? I couldn't, not when he didn't love me any more. Somehow, I can't explain, it seemed a worse thing to do than the other. He argued a little, but he went away. Do you think I did right, Valancy? Yes, I do. You did right. But he... Don't blame him, dear. Please don't. Let's not talk about him at all. There's no need. I wanted to tell you how it was. I didn't want you to think me bad. I never did think so. Yes, I felt that, whenever you came. Oh, Valancy, what you've been to me! I can never tell you, but God will bless you for it. I know He will. With what measure ye meet. Sissy sobbed for a few minutes in Valancy's arms. Then she wiped her eyes. Well, that's almost all. I came home. I wasn't really so very unhappy. I suppose I should have been, but I wasn't. Father wasn't hard on me, and my baby was so sweet, Valancy, with such lovely blue eyes and little rings of pale gold hair like silk floss, and tiny dimpled hands. I used to bite his satin-smooth little face all over softly, so as not to hurt him, you know. I know, said Valancy, wincing. I know. A woman always knows, and dreams. And he was all mine. Nobody else had any claim on him. When he died, oh, Valancy, I thought I must die too. I didn't see how anybody could endure such anguish and live. To see his dear little eyes and know he would never open them again, to miss his warm little body nestled against mine at night, and think of him sleeping alone and cold, his wee face under the hard frozen earth. It was so awful for the first year. After that it was a little easier. One didn't keep thinking, this day last year. But I was so glad when I found out I was dying. Who could endure life if it were not for the hope of death? Murmured Valancy softly. It was, of course, a quotation from some book of John Foster's. I'm glad I told you all about it, sighed Sissy. I wanted you to know. Sissy died a few nights after that. Roaring Abel was away. When Valancy saw the change that had come over Sissy's face, she wanted to telephone for the doctor, but Sissy wouldn't let her. Valancy, why should you? He can do nothing for me. I've known for several days that this was near. Let me die in peace, dear, just holding your hand. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Tell Father good-bye for me. He's always been as good to me as he knew how. And Barney. Somehow I think that Barney but a spasm of coughing interrupted and exhausted her. She fell asleep when it was over, still holding to Valancy's hand. Valancy sat there in the silence. She was not frightened or even sorry. At sunrise, Sissy died. She opened her eyes and looked past Valancy at something that made her smile suddenly and happily, and smiling, she died. Valancy crossed Sissy's hands on her breast and went to the open window. In the eastern sky, amid the fires of sunrise, an old moon was hanging, as slender and lovely as a new moon. Valancy had never seen an old moon before. She watched it pale and fade until it paled and faded out of sight in the living rose of day. A little pool in the barrens shone in the sunrise, like a great golden lily. But the world suddenly seemed a colder place to Valancy. Again, nobody needed her. She was not in the least sorry Cecilia was dead. She was only sorry for all her suffering in life. But nobody could ever hurt her again. Valancy had always thought death dreadful, but Sissy had died so quietly, so pleasantly, and at the very last, something had made up to her for everything. She was lying there now, in her white sleep, looking like a child. Beautiful. All the lines of shame and pain gone. Roaring Abel drove in, justifying his name. Valancy went down and told him. The shock sobered him at once. He slumped down on the seat of his buggy, his great head hanging. "Sissy dead! Sissy dead!" he said vacantly. "I didn't think it would come so soon. Dead. She used to run down the lane to meet me with a little white rose stuck in her hair. Sissy used to be a pretty little girl, and a good little girl." "She has always been a good little girl," said Valancy. End of chapter 23. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, January 14, 2022. The Blue Castle by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Valancy herself made Sissy ready for burial. No hands but hers should touch that pitiful, wasted little body. The old house was spotless on the day of burial. Barney Snaith was not there. He had done all he could to help Valancy before it. He had shrouded the pale Cecilia in white roses from the garden, and then had gone back to his island. But everybody else was there. All Deerwood and Up Back came. They forgave Sissy splendidly at last. Mr. Bradley gave a very beautiful funeral address. Valancy had wanted her old Free Methodist man, but Roaring Abel was obdurate. He was a Presbyterian, and no one but a Presbyterian minister should bury his daughter. Mr. Bradley was very tactful. He avoided all dubious points, and it was plain to be seen he hoped for the best. 6 reputable citizens of Deerwood bore Cecilia Gay to her grave in decorous Deerwood Cemetery. Among them was Uncle Wellington. The Stirlings all came to the funeral, men and women. They had had a family conclave over it. Surely now that Sissy Gay was dead, Valancy would come home. She simply could not stay there with Roaring Abel. That being the case, the wisest course, decreed Uncle James, was to attend the funeral, legitimize the whole thing, so to speak, show Deerwood that Valancy had really done a most creditable deed in going to nurse poor Cecilia Gay, and that her family backed her up in it. Death, the miracle worker, suddenly made the thing quite respectable. If Valancy would return to home and decency while public opinion was under its influence, all might yet be well. Society was suddenly forgetting all Cecilia's wicked doings, and remembering what a pretty, modest little thing she had been. And motherless, you know, motherless. It was a psychological moment, said Uncle James. So the Stirlings went to the funeral. Even Cousin Gladys's neuritis allowed her to come. Cousin Stickles was there, her bonnet dripping all over her face, crying as woefully as if Sissy had been her nearest and dearest. Funerals always brought Cousin Stickles' own sad bereavement back. And Uncle Wellington was a pallbearer. Valancy, pale, subdued-looking, her slanted eyes smudged with purple, in her snuff-brown dress, moving quietly about, finding seats for people, consulting in undertones with minister and undertaker, marshalling the mourners into the parlor, was so decorous and proper and Stirlingish that her family took heart of grace. This was not, could not be, the girl who had sat all night in the woods with Barney Snaith, who had gone tearing bareheaded through Deerwood and Port Lawrence. This was the Valancy they knew, really surprisingly capable and efficient. Perhaps she had always been kept down a bit too much. Amelia really was rather strict, hadn't had a chance to show what was in her. So thought the Stirlings. And Edward Beck, from the Port Road, a widower with a large family who was beginning to take notice, took notice of Valancy and thought she might make a mighty fine second wife. No beauty, but a 50-year-old widower, Mr. Beck told himself very reasonably, couldn't expect everything. Altogether, it seemed that Valancy's matrimonial chances were never so bright as they were at Cecilia Gay's funeral. What the Stirlings and Edward Beck would have thought, had they known the back of Valancy's mind, must be left to the imagination. Valancy was hating the funeral, hating the people who came to stare with curiosity at Cecilia's marble-white face, hating the smugness, hating the dragging, melancholy singing, hating Mr. Bradley's cautious platitudes. If she could have had her absurd way, there would have been no funeral at all. She would have covered Sissy over with flowers, shut her away from prying eyes, and buried her beside her nameless little baby in the grassy burying ground under the pines of the up-back church, with a bit of kindly prayer from the old Free Methodist minister. She remembered Sissy saying once, "I wish I could be buried deep in the heart of the woods, where nobody would ever come to say, 'Sissy Gay is buried here,' and tell over my miserable story." But this, however, it would soon be over. Valancy knew, if the Stirlings and Edward Beck didn't, exactly what she intended to do then. She had lain awake all the preceding night, thinking about it and finally deciding on it. When the funeral procession had left the house, Mrs. Frederick sought out Valancy in the kitchen. "My child," she said tremulously, "you'll come home now?" "Home," said Valancy absently. She was getting on an apron and calculating how much tea she must put to steep for supper. There would be several guests from "up back," distant relatives of the Gays who had not remembered them for years, and she was so tired she wished she could borrow a pair of legs from the cat. "Yes, home," said Mrs. Frederick, with a touch of asperity. "I suppose you won't dream of staying here now, alone with Roaring Abel." "Oh, no, I'm not going to stay here," said Valancy. "Of course I'll have to stay for a day or two, to put the house in order generally. But that will be all. Excuse me, Mother, won't you? I've a frightful lot to do. All those up-back people will be here to supper." Mrs. Frederick retreated in considerable relief, and the Stirlings went home with lighter hearts. "We will just treat her as if nothing had happened when she comes back," decreed Uncle Benjamin. "That will be the best plan. Just as if nothing had happened." End of chapter 24.